They committed to halting the extinction of threatened animal, plant, and fungi species. And in an historic first, they also committed to helping those species recover, so that the life we share our planet with can not only survive, but thrive. Making these goals a reality will take all of us working together. Reverse the Red is supporting governments, conservation experts, and communities around the world as they join forces to activate tried and tested tools and tie global efforts to local expertise. All in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can secure our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our final webinar ahead of the World Conservation Congress. We started with some plant and freshwater motions back in August and have moved through extinct in the wild, networks in Mesoamerica, and genetics all the way till now. We're working with the Marine Conservation Committee on some non-selective fisheries discussions. And so a couple of housekeeping notes. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and where you are calling in from today. And then as we go through, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. If you have any questions for our presenters, please feel free to just add those in there, and they can either type out an answer or with time at the end, maybe answer a few live. So please do ask as many questions as you have throughout. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Amanda to introduce the session and her presenters.
Yeah, hello, my name is Amanda Vincent. I'm the chair of the IUCN SSC Marine Conservation Committee and also have another hat you'll hear about later. And I'm really excited to be introducing our session on non-selective fisheries. It's terribly important that we understand that the single biggest threat to most marine life is poorly managed exploitation. Even though we allow for the fact, of course, that habitat damage and invasive species and plastics, a number of other pressures are really significant. The issue of non-selective fisheries is paramount for a great many taxa, and that you're going to hear a bit more about. So the Marine Conservation Committee has been working with our many wonderful, amazing specialist groups to come up with an understanding of just how significant a pressure this is. So let me get us started here. So I do want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and we are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of three Indigenous peoples, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And it's tremendously important to me to acknowledge the stewardship that they have practiced over millennia, and to be grateful for the fact that I benefit from being able to live, work, and play on these lands. Please take a moment just to acknowledge the Indigenous people of whatever part of the world you find yourself in and the many contributions that they have made to the maintenance of our biodiversity over such a long time. I think at the heart of this webinar, as in so many others, is the need to acknowledge that when we look at marine life, we are looking at wildlife. And this is really important. We tend to, the world tends to regard marine as very other. And given that the ocean covers 99% of the biosphere on Earth, and yes, 70% of the surface, but we do embrace 99% of the biosphere, it's really quite significant and important that we pushed for the recognition of marine life as being wildlife. And that's, of course, the animals, the plants, and the fungi that we find in and around our waters. So the people who are stewarding that within the IUCN framework are the members of the specialist groups. And we now have quite a number of marine specialist groups ever growing. We've recently made a push on trying to add some of the lesser known taxa, but tremendously significant ones like seaweeds and aquatic fungi, sponges, marine stars, and so on. Newest one is a Goby and Blenny specialist group. And we're very proud at the Marine Conservation Committee to be able to support and amplify the work that these fantastic groups of volunteer experts execute during their time. And the sort of work they do can be dropped into about 5 categories. So there's a lot of assessment that goes on, which you will commonly have heard of in the context of red list assessments. And then the assessment can convert to planning, which can drive action, which informs further evaluation and assessment. And we can enter this conservation cycle anywhere. We don't have to start with assessment. And what we're talking about now will hopefully move from assessment, planning, and action and round again in the course of this webinar, brief though it may be. We're also tremendously committed to networking and communicating, and that is in evidence today. So this is the Species Survival Commission work in a nutshell today. So to move us on to the issue of bottom trawling, of non-selective fisheries, I'd like you to close your eyes just for a moment, if you would, and just try to imagine a really wonderful seascape. Well, actually, let's do it differently. Imagine a wonderful hillscape. So you're staring at a hill or a mountain or a forest that you love, and all of a sudden, gigantic nets are dropped from on high, and the entire landscape in front of you is plowed up, leaving nothing but devastation. The plants and animals are removed wholly, whether it's a bee or a bear or a bird or whatever it is, that is now gone, leaving plowed up soil and degraded soil. This is the sort of thing that happens with bottom trawling, one of the versions of non-selective fisheries. So if you open your eyes now, we want to highlight the fact that we'll be discussing non-selective fisheries at the World Conservation Congress. There is a special event about collateral damage from these fisheries, and most importantly, possible solutions. The event happens on October 11th, and it is 1600 in Abu Dhabi time. The rest of us will have to convert, and it is an online symposium, so everybody in the world can join. And this will look at both the ecological and the socioeconomic impacts of non-selective fisheries, looking at their impacts on biodiversity, but also the roles they play in human well-being and food security. So moving on, I want to introduce the plan for this webinar, which is quite simple. We're going to be joined by leaders of 4 other specialist groups. So Gianna Minton, who's the co-chair of the Cetacean Specialist Group, will lead off first by describing a cross-taxon assessment that we've conducted, and then by discussing cetacean-specific issues. Professor Helene Marsh will talk about Sirenians, which are the dugongs. And then Anne-Marie Alvarez will talk about the other cetacean, or the main other cetaceans, which are the manatees. And then Brian Wallace has kindly offered to talk to us about the marine turtles. And I'll take it forward by talking about the seahorses primarily, although might allude to the pipefish and sea dragons before wrapping it up. So that's the lay of the land. And without any more ado, I would like to hand it over to Gianna.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Amanda. Can everyone see my screen now? Great. So as Amanda said, we're going to dive into the collateral damage that can occur from non-selective fisheries. And I'll start off with a summary of an expert elicitation we did with some marine species specialist groups from the IUCN. And although I'm speaking today, I'd like to give a special shout out to Coralie Palmer, who's on the call and who helped to collate and develop a lot of this material. So what makes collateral damage so costly? Well, it can cause lethal and sublethal impacts to individual animals, which of course can lead to species declines and extinctions. But it also causes destruction to habitats, habitat-forming species such as corals and sponges and seagrasses, and this damage can have long-term impacts and take centuries to recover. So for all of these reasons, we decided that this should be one of the biggest areas of focus for the IUCN SSC Marine Conservation Committee, which Amanda chairs. The survey that we decided to put together for Marine Specialist Group chairs was taken by 31 experts from 26 different groups, and those groups are represented by their icons, their logos here. The survey had 18 questions that focused on the impacts of non-selective fisheries on each group species and habitats. And it was composed of a mixture of multiple choice, ranking, and open-ended questions. And respondents were also able to upload papers and reports and references. So just zooming through some of the outcomes, which we'll go into in more depth during the session in Abu Dhabi. 74% of the respondents rated collateral damage from non-selective fisheries as a primary or significant threat to their species group. And just to remind everyone, we're talking about collateral damage rather than straightforward bycatch, because we want to include the impacts to habitat-forming species and species that may be commercially targeted rather than just those that we think of traditionally as bycatch species. For example, sharks, rays, and chimeras, over 99% of shark and ray species are threatened with are affected by non-selective fisheries, and 37.5% of shark and ray species are threatened with extinction. When we asked people about the gears of greatest concern, overwhelmingly bottom trawls and gill nets were listed as those that caused the most pervasive and persistent damage to different species groups. And if we look at how that breaks down, again, bottom trawls and gill nets were reported to affect the highest number of species, with those in dark blue circles here being perceived as having pervasive damage from non-selective fisheries, and those in the medium blue circles having common damage to their species. And the other gears, traps, seine nets, surrounding nets, dredges, trawls, long lines were listed as being either pervasive or common for a number of other species. So in short, non-selective fisheries are having negative impacts on the widest range of marine species you can imagine, all the way from habitat forming, seaweeds and seagrasses to top predators like dolphins and sharks. When we asked people about what types of fisheries were causing the most damage, we learned that people perceive, that the specialist group chairs perceive every level of fisheries to be causing damage from non-selective gears. And so that ranges from small-scale artisanal skiffs like this one in Oman, to national fisheries run from medium-sized or larger boats, commercial fisheries, to national fisheries using full-scale industrial-size trawlers and other types of gear, as well as international commercial industrial fisheries. If we look more closely at the issue of gill nets and the type of damage that they cause, they're one of the most worrying gears because they're often left to soak unattended for many, many hours at a time. They're inexpensive and low-tech, and for this reason, they're one of the most common gears used in small-scale artisanal fisheries around the world, and they affect a lot of the nearshore species that live in these habitats. They're responsible for the extinction of the budgie, the Yangtze River dolphin, and the near extinction of the vaquita, and they're a main threat to most endangered and critically endangered cetaceans. And as another example, when harp seals extend their summer ranges south because of capeland collapses, tens of thousands of seals can be caught in coastally set gill nets. Looking more closely at bottom trawls, they have indiscriminate catch. They drag across the seabed, as Amanda said, and they destroy whole habitats, which can take centuries to recover. And looking more closely, I'm sure Amanda will tell us more about this, but each bottom trawler may only take 1 to 2 seahorses per night, but because bottom trawling effort is so pervasive in many parts of the world, Countries like Vietnam or Thailand can catch millions of seahorses a year. And we need to remember that this impact of non-selective fisheries isn't only affecting the species that we consider traditional bycatch, non-target catch, but it's also affecting commercially important species, such as snappers, sea breams, and grunts, 40% of 40 different species of which may undergo substantial juvenile bycatch mortality from trawling in shrimp or finfish fisheries. And in Central Asia, individual trawl fisheries can capture over 400 metric tons annually of threadfin and breams. So fishing at the wrong time can cause population declines, but understanding the overall impact and quantifying it is really difficult because it requires several life stage and mortality specific estimates that are usually unavailable in fisheries. And again, coming back to the fact that this isn't only affecting individual bycatch species, but whole habitats. We know that this affects seagrasses and coral reefs and sponges. And if you haven't yet watched David Attenborough's Ocean movie, I found this to be one of the most impactful ways of really understanding the destruction of non-selective bottom trawling fisheries and the impact it can have. The images and the video footage are really hard-hitting. So what are some suggested solutions? Well, time area closures, including the creation of protected areas, are probably one of the best ways to avoid any non-selective fisheries damage. But also improved monitoring and enforcement of existing regulations could go a long way towards solving the problem. Many countries and regions already have the right laws and regulations in place. Gear restrictions and bans or asking fisheries to switch gears to more selective methods could have a big impact, as could the introduction of technological innovations such as acoustic alerts, lights, or excluder devices. Offering incentives to fishers to use more selective methods, for example, through market incentives would be helpful, or switching livelihoods, and creating quotas on fleet sizes or quotas that trigger fisheries closures would also be helpful. But it's really important to make sure that this is done in collaboration with the fishers and the fisheries that will be affected, and to remember that there is no silver bullet, that solutions must be location and species dependent. There's some barriers to implementing these solutions that we know we have. As we said, poor enforcement of existing regulations, primarily a lack of awareness, knowledge, and political will among policymakers, and also the dependence on income, particularly for small-scale artisanal fishers and coastal communities, and the lack of alternative livelihoods. There's also a lack of acceptable alternative gears. There are a lot of sort of high-tech innovations that are available, but these are difficult to scale up to the right level, and they can be too expensive or too complicated for many fisheries to use. And again, this is all coming from our survey results. The experts we consulted felt that limiting funding and capacity to scale up solutions is also one of the barriers towards solving this issue. So in short, we'd like to create a call to action to make sure that this preventable driver of biodiversity loss that affects individuals, species, and habitats can be tackled at all levels. We need to do this through reaching out to international, regional, and national policy fora and management bodies. We need to interact with large-scale fisheries industry representatives, and we need to tackle things at the local level by engaging with artisanal fishing communities. And if we need to start somewhere, if we can't tackle everything at once, we should start with gill nets and bottom trawls. So that ends my summary of our survey results. I just want to make sure that we thank the many SSC Marine Species Group leaders who shared their knowledge, the IUCN Global Center for Species Survival at the Indianapolis Zoo, and in particular, Kelly Grease and Ryoka Hayama for the graphics that were included in this presentation.
Thank you, Gianna. And now it would be great to hear about the mammals. And I know you're going to give us quite a rapid summary of these. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So you'll see a little bit of overlap. Now I'm switching hats from my Marine Conservation Committee member hat to my role as a co-chair of the Cetacean Specialist Group. We'll just look a little bit more closely at the impacts of non-selective fisheries on whales, dolphins, and porpoises. These are affected by bycatch because they're air-breathing mammals that cannot breathe and cannot get to the surface if they're trapped in gear. They're slow to reproduce. They only have offspring every 1 to 2 years. So mortality, low levels of mortality can have really large lasting impacts. For cetaceans, probably the greatest, the most problematic gears are gill nets, and fisheries bycatch is causing extinctions, and we think that over 300,000 cetaceans per year are killed in bycatch annually around the globe. And we think that even within the Indian Ocean, as many as 80,000 per year may be killed in gill net fisheries. Gill nets are the most problematic, as we've already said, but for cetaceans, traps and pots that have lines from the bottom up to the surface can also be problematic, as can trawls and long lines, where often cetaceans depredate either the bait or the catch on the long lines and then get tangled. In looking at areas that are particularly worrisome, there haven't been very many global reviews, but those that have yield a few potential insights into hotspots. The problem is that these are very much dependent on fisheries that have good records of bycatch, and we know that many fisheries around the world are not well monitored. If we look at hotspots by species that are affected, we can see that there are a number of species and populations that are endangered or critically endangered around the entire globe that are affected by bycatch. And in every one of these populations highlighted here, bycatch is thought to be the main driver of population decline. Again, looking at mitigation measures, there's some overlap with those that were listed for all marine species. They can include the way that gears are deployed, like back down measures in the in purse seine fisheries, the use of technical adaptations like acoustic devices or gear switching. We can use ropeless fishing to remove the lines from the bottom of the sea to the surface. Excluder advices are used on trawl fishing in some places with some success. And of course, there are many disentanglement guidelines, although this is a last resort and the preference is not to let the animals become entangled at all. So really, time area closures are considered the best scalable solution because most are technically expensive and hard to scale up. So we would advocate for more research and development on acceptable alternative gears or technical adaptations, improved monitoring and documentation of bycatch, and most of all, collaboration with fishermen to come up with innovative solutions that are going to be acceptable and workable to them. And all of these require awareness raising and capacity building, and we need to make sure that the stakeholders believe in and care about mitigating and reducing bycatch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gianna. That was masterful. Loved hearing about all the different specialist groups and their many thoughts about how significant bottom trawling and other non-selective gears, gill nets in particular, are for their taxa. And with that, we'll turn to Helene Marsh, co-chair of the Serenid Specialist Group, to talk about the dugongs. Thank you, Helene.
Thanks, Amanda. So I'm going to talk about dugongs, which are sea cows, and Anne-Marie will talk about their cousins, manatees. So these are seagrass community specialists, which means they only occur in inshore waters where seagrasses can go. And they have a huge range, and dugongs have a huge range, and they range from some of the poorest countries on Earth, for example, the ones, the red ones here with in Africa, through to relatively rich countries like Australia and the Arabian countries. And the solutions to this problem are very different in different places. And that's a take-home message here. And there isn't a silver bullet. So next slide. So the small scale
don't have your
fisheries are now
slides.
the,
I
pardon?
don't, sorry, go ahead. Oh yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I was on the wrong thing. Go ahead, sorry.
Is there a problem? Can you
No,
see?
it's all good.
Oh,
All good, sorry.
okay. The small scale fisheries are the major cause of dugong mortality and a major cause of habitat loss. So here we have, and can you click please, Gianna? We have pictures of dugongs in both in gill nets in Australia and in China, but this is the result of interviewing of more than 10,000 fishers in 23 range states. And my key message here is that although gill nets are the biggest problem, the dugongs get caught in a lot of different gears, which makes alternative gears quite problematic. And 10% of the respondents in these surveys said they've caught dugongs, and dugongs are quite have low populations in many places, so one being caught matters. Next one slide. So I'm just going to give you an example. This is this place here between India and Sri Lanka. Now, this is a three-dimensional human population map. You can see, you know, this huge population in India, and in this tiny little place here, it was estimated that there were 900 vessels operating with the potential to kill dugongs and 3,100 vessels with the potential to damage seagrass. And this is the seagrass that's being caught in nets in that area. There are no current data on incidental catch or population size. There's a small closure area, but it's minute. It's absolutely inadequate for animals that move a great deal. Next slide. But it's not only dugongs. There are examples of IUCN listed dolphins in these inshore waters outside Australia. Next slide. So I think the range maps for all these species are in grave danger of being rewritten. I expect that these coastal marine mammals, including dugongs, are going to disappear from a huge proportion of the range unless we do something. Next slide. So the solutions must be place specific. Australia, which is a rich country with not many people, is in the last stage of a 30-year process of buying out gill netters in the dugongs range. So it's used a combination of closure areas and buyouts, but it's taken a long time and many, many millions of dollars. And that is unachievable in many of these countries. The low-income countries are dependent on small-scale fisheries for food security. So this is a much harder issue, particularly for species that are caught with more than one gear type. Most of the fishes are using multiple gears. So the Society of Marine Mammalogists are developing a toolkit of best practice research methods for bycatch reduction in small-scale fisheries in low-income countries, because we're realising that for many of these places, because it's so important to work with the fishermen, you can't just solutions have to be customised, and we're working with people from the CMS and the relevant IUCN groups. And the emphasis, I think, is largely going to be human dimensions research to work with the fishermen to try and work out what will work. In the past, a lot of effort has been put on technical solutions that are not really applicable in most of these very low income countries. So we have to work with the fishers to get their ideas about what will work. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Helene, for a masterful talk. That was tremendously interesting. And I'll pass over to Anne-Marie Alvarez, the co-chair of the Surrounded Specialist Groups, to talk about, as Helene said, their cousins, the manatees.
Are you guys seeing the slides?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, going into the manatee work a little bit, as a reminder, we are a group that contains 3 different species inhabiting in the Atlantic region: the American manatee, the Amazonian manatee, and the African manatee. And this group as well has a huge interaction with non-selective fisheries or bycatch, either from commercial or small-scale fishery, but also artisanal fisheries. So, as I mentioned, they are highly vulnerable to non-selective fishing. However, the term in this case is highly used as incidental entanglement or entanglement in fishing gears, and they impact vary greatly across the different region and the different species and the populations. Because unfortunately, in most of the cases, the species that is incidentally captured became a target species. So the carcass is not disposed and is rather used by the fishermen or the local people that interact with the species. And these interactions are mostly associated with fishing operation that occurs in shallow water, for example, seagrass beds, as Helene mentioned, because of the distribution and the ecological requirements of the species. Basically associated to entangle or ingesting lines or hook, which tend not to be as mortal or nocive as, for example, entangling in gill nets or troll nets, as is known in many of the distribution areas, chinchorros, seine nets, drift nets, etc. And sometimes, as I mentioned, the most important is the poaching, that like the hunting, that is used also with this net, but also other instruments like spear guns or harpoons. This is an example of all the different type of nets and fishing gear that is being described in association with manatees population in Colombia. So the variability is high, and I will say that the impact is different also. For example, for Florida subspecies and Amazonian species, we can say that this incidental entanglement is present, perhaps not as impactful as what we see in some of the countries from the Greater Caribbean and for in the country for the Africa species. African manatee, for example, is mostly consistently a severe affected by this interaction. The interaction is mostly entanglement in nets, which can cause direct mortality, but many times the animals just don't die but break the nets and even compete with fishermen but getting the fish from the net. So what started as just an interaction became a conflict, and then the fishers can and want to go ahead and deliberate kill the animal, which at the end end up with the end of the individual. But as I mentioned, the most important pressure is the poaching, and sometimes the poaching associated with this incidental entanglement. In the Amazonian manatee, the incidental occurs also, but again, it's not the main driver of mortality because other threats are important, such like hunting and habitat loss. And for the American manatee, we see that incidental entanglement is pretty significant in countries such as Colombia, La Española, which has Haiti and Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, Venezuela, Honduras. And this negative interaction occurs where there is lethal entanglement in the net. The animal end up dying. And this, of course, reduce the survival of the individuals and the reproduction, and affected what is already highly fragmented and small population. So, for example, I'm showing you some photos of how this interaction can be visualized. This is in West Africa, and manatee was entangled in a fishing net. In Jamaica, at least 5 manatees were observed to be inside a porcine net. In Cuba, manatee got entangled in a stationary net. So it was a small gill net used as trap to capture fish in small lagoons and river. Individuals being affected by lines that constrict the pectoral fins, and in this case, it was causing the significant constricting in the pectoral fin. At some point, the animal was not going to be able to swim. We were able to find the individual and remove part of the line. And spear guns and what seems to be explosive tips used to kill a manatee. So this is just an example of how variable this interaction can be and how complex can be, especially when we are gonna try to find ways to eliminate this. Some of the conservation priorities needs to be dedicated to recognize and understand what are the regional difference in the different fishery manatees interaction. And this, of course, can be doing through stranded monitorings and data collection. It is very important to engage local fisher and try to eradicate potential conflicts. Integrate manatee conservation into national fisheries regulation. This is, for example, the case in Cuba, where the most important piece of regulation for manatee is inside the fishing law, and that somehow help a little bit to achieve conservation and protection in some of the area and build a regional cooperation network. Some of the measurements that we can take are related to some of the previous lecture mentioned that, but in relation to gear modification, spatial and temporal restriction, which we can see it in with the establishment of marine protected areas that might work for some places, not so much for other. Provide alternative livelihood. We were able to eradicate the use of fishing nets in one marine protected area in a community in Cuba, and now we are working as how these fishermen that have been fishing all their life, what can they do instead to improve their livelihood, increase rescue capacity, and of course, awareness and education. But the most important thing is that the conservation priorities and the action need to reflect the difference in ecological, social, and economic reality that we see across the distribution of these species. So adapted to each region, sub-region, or even country. And I wanted to end with this photo, which is my last slide, which is a manatee captured by a trawl net, a chinchorro, in Cuba. And before, what the government used to do is that once the manatee was found, they distributed across like schools or daycares for food. So this situation is been taking place for a long time. It has changed a little bit, but the important thing is we have to adapt and be creative and modify the ways that we can use to mitigate these events. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. What a lovely coverage of the manatees. Really interesting. And now we hand off to Brian Wallace. And Brian is the Red List Authority Coordinator for the Marine Turtle Specialist Group. Thanks so much, Brian. Brian, yeah, great, perfect. We see your slides wonderfully. Brian, we can neither see nor hear you right now. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Hear you. There we go. Perfect. We got it.
Yes. Okay. All right. A big thanks to Coralie and Megan for getting us together. Thanks, Amanda, for chairing, and to my fellow panelists. Really helped set the table on a lot of important concepts. And so folks are probably going to hear some similar themes come up here through the marine turtle perspective, but that's good. Hopefully we're reinforcing each other, find a lot of commonalities here. So speaking of which, and sort of to set the table, I wanted to just call attention to a study published a few years ago, kind of testing the hypothesis that that fisheries management and bycatch reduction are not, it's not an either-or proposition, but in fact, what's the possibility of win-win solutions whereby rebuilding fisheries also can benefit those protected species that are non-target but affected by fishing activities. And so this was kind of a modeling and thought experiment exercise, at least to demonstrate proof of concept of this win-win idea. And in fact, some of the take-home messages, rebuilding fisheries can benefit protected species taken as bycatch, that maximizing economic yields, or if we also did it by MSY, sustainable yields, could stop declines of more than half of the protected mammal, turtle, and bird populations examined. And in particular, now as we kind of swing into turtles in particular, among all those protected species, turtle populations appeared to be well positioned to benefit from sustainably managed fisheries. So again, just kind of keeping in mind that there are possibilities for win-wins, that one doesn't have to cancel out the other. So a little bit of the too long don't read version here. I'm going to touch on these a little bit more in the next couple of minutes, but through the last couple of decades, let's say, of assessing impacts of bycatch to marine turtles, what have we learned? Well, one, you've heard this again a couple times already. Where data are available, they can be useful to identify patterns and hotspots, but data aren't always available uniformly, whether it's spatially or temporally. But what we do know is that bycatch marine turtles occurs across oceanscapes. These can be large and small scale fisheries, coastal oceanic habitats, because marine turtles, of course, are widespread across all of these different habitats, and then across national and international borders. Bycatch continues to be a major threat for many marine turtle populations around the world. Yes, there's lots of threats, but as Amanda, I think, mentioned at the outset, this is really important to keep in mind. And of course, also important to note that bycatch affects fishers in their communities, especially at the small scale. And so what we continue to advocate for are more holistic win-win solutions, those that will promote sustainability in fisheries as well as bycatch reduction. So what do we know about turtle bycatch? So years ago, we did a global assessment of bycatch impacts to turtle populations, where we tried to compile all of the available information across longlines, nets, and trawls in those broad categories. And then to map those by turtle population, because we don't want to just understand and highlight where there's high bycatch documented, but also where that bycatch across gears cumulatively can affect populations, because ultimately those are the targets of our conservation interventions. And then bringing that together a little bit, and I appreciate Gianna showed this figure earlier for mammals, but looking across taxa, of course, there's opportunities to try to identify spatially important areas, as well as gear-specific important priorities for targets for bycatch reduction. And for marine turtles in particular, across all of these global assessments, a few regions in particular tend to pop out. But of course, remember, this is also data dependent, right? This is where we have good information. And where we have good information, we're able to highlight where there are bycatch impacts. So speaking of which, and into a much more contemporary version, we just published earlier this year through the Marine Turtle Specialist Group's Burning Issues Initiative, and a paper highlighting global conservation status and priorities across marine turtles. And what we did here was we evaluated population risk or viability criteria, as well as threats, and bringing those together gives us a rich perspective on not just those populations that might be the most endangered or the closest to extinction, but also all sorts of different conservation priorities. What I want to draw your attention to here, because we're talking about bycatch, is if we look at this table compares how via expert elicitation those threat scores have changed over time. And based on expert elicitation, what we see is that all threats in the 2024 category scores have improved, or they've decreased in impact, except for bycatch. Bycatch remains the only threat that's still moderate to high globally across regions, and every species has at least one population with high bycatch impacts. So you've heard some specifics with respect to potential bycatch reduction measures or techniques, or technologies. But I kind of wanted to launch off that last point, that despite a lot of really, really great effort and learnings over time, both from failures and successes, why has success with bycatch reduction been hard to achieve? And this is a little bit maybe the Brian perspective, maybe this is a little bit of the turtle perspective, but I think there's some commonalities again that It's more about conservation practice, I think. The problem of bycatch, as it's described, and then those potential solutions tend to be framed by conservationists. So we're coming from a very specific perspective. In reality, it's a really complex issue that requires time and effort and persistence. You've heard the no silver bullet thing multiple times. You've heard it's a location specific or fishery specific thing. Those are absolutely true. But of course, that also means that scalable solutions are going to be a lot trickier to try to identify. We tend to, as conservationists, come at it because we care about the species. So first, we're prioritizing species-specific research studies, experiments, gear trials, etc. And then later, we sort of try to figure out how do we bring in fishers, how do we implement, how do we scale these things. A lot of times we attempt to change how fishers think and act, why it's really important to care about sea turtles, as opposed to the other way around. Like as conservationists, how can we adjust how we approach things, how we think about a situation that doesn't just involve us and the species we care about, but are already in sociocultural, socioeconomic situations that were there and will be there, whether we are or not. So again, just ending on advocating for a more holistic, collaborative kind of philosophy or set of approaches that supports improved fishery sustainability at all scales. And that sustainability includes bycatch reduction. It's not an afterthought. It's not something that's bolted on later. But like Anne-Marie mentioned, incorporating this within criteria for successful fisheries management, I think is the way we really need to start pushing things a lot harder. So thanks again for the time and attention, and I'll turn it back over to Amanda, I think, correct?
Thanks so much, Brian. That was lovely. And I'm so enjoying the convergence of many of the ideas and themes as we go forward. And hopefully I'll add to that with my own talk now on seahorses. So I'm going to talk about non-selective fisheries and seahorses. And I chair the Seahorse, Pipefish, and Sea Dragon Specialist Group. We have about 320 species, and the seahorses comprise about 46 of those species, but much of what I'm going to say is also deeply relevant to the pipefish and sea dragons. So the seahorses, there are about 46 species found all over the world, from in all temperate and tropical waters, mostly coastal, but some are a bit deeper. And they're also found in estuaries and lagoons, which becomes quite important. And they range in size from your baby fingernail to your forearm. These guys are very particular because they have a male pregnancy with intense parental care, and many of the species form long-term pair bonds. So they have slow reproductive rates and will not fare well under intense fishing pressure. They're also very limited in their mobility and their dispersal patterns. The threats to seahorses are certainly, for the lagoonal and estuarine species, are habitat damage to seagrasses, seaweeds, coral reefs, mangroves, soft bottom habitats. But the prevalent threat for species that are in the more open habitats along the coasts is definitely non-selective fisheries. And those non-selective fisheries come in many forms, as I will show you in a minute, but they're collectively imposing enormous damage on the populations of these animals. And about a third of seahorses are threatened, and about a third are data deficient. So we don't have that many that are doing well. This is a map of where we know of non-selective fisheries for seahorses. So the hashed areas are where they're either inland or outside the seahorses range. But the countries that have dark coloration indicates where we know there is non-selective fishing for these animals, with greater and greater sources confirming this. Now, a lot of our information comes from our own extensive field surveys in tens of countries, but we also draw on the literature recently for a new study that we're about to release, and I'll show you where we're going with that. So this is a flow figure, if you will, that starts with the fishing sector, and you'll find that in the 688 references and records that we just assessed, that the fishing sector was not specified in a great many of them, but the artisanal and commercial sectors are both recognized as having fishing impacts on seahorses. The huge effect of fishing is in Asia, but it does extend around the world. And you'll also see, and this is really important, that target is this tiny percentage here. So the thin little ribbons that head off from target indicate how much of the catch of seahorses is targeted. There are some trawl fisheries intended for seahorses, some dive fisheries intended for seahorses, but all the rest, these thick ribbons, almost all the ribbons in their full width, are non-selective, unintentional captures of seahorses. By diving, certainly, but also by trawls is the dominant effort. Although, again, even for seahorses, gill nets are a significant consideration and concern. So bottom trawling and gill nets dominate, which is a theme you've been hearing a lot, and the huge proportion of seahorse captures around the world are unintended with only a very limited target fishery. Some of the gears are very small scale, like these fishing gears in communities in the Philippines where they're just stationary life nets or they're gill nets, but you also do have small scale trawls in many coastal regions, and not all small scale fisheries are benign. These trawls are so intense and so numerous that small scale trawls impose tremendous pressure. However, the biggest single issue is larger scale multi-person trawls, commercial trawls. So that trawling pressure is extremely intense. There are about 100,000 bottom trawlers operating around the world every day. And we haven't really talked about the scale of that, but about 100,000 trawlers a day. And indeed, in India, there are tens of thousands of trawlers. And as with the example that Helene gave for Polk Bay in southern India, that's an area we've worked in too. And again, the trawl pressure is of enormous concern there. This is what a trawl catch often looks like now in many parts of the world. So it might have been intended for shrimp, but the trawlers have become less and less selective and more scraping the bottom for anything they can get. And this is the seahorse. So you commonly only see 1 to 2 seahorses per vessel per night. 1 to 2 seahorses per vessel per night, as Gianna foreshadowed. But what's remarkable is the number that we get cumulatively. So from an analysis we're about to release, we think we're getting about 54 million seahorses caught in bottom trawls every year. So figure out just how intense that bottom trawl effort is to go from 1 or 2 seahorses per vessel per night to about 54 million seahorses caught annually around the world. And that will explain why we're so concerned for all our taxa in the face of this tremendously damaging, threatening, non-selective gear. So that's really the point I wanted to make in the context of seahorses. Gill nets are of concern, bottom trawls dominate, but even the gill nets, we're catching about 13 million seahorses a year. And as you go down, this is not otherwise indicated, but then you have the seine nets picking out 5 million a year, and it goes down. So we think our grand total is about 88 million seahorses caught every year from species that do not flourish under fishing pressure. So the seahorses are another taxa that we should be worried about. One thing I want to mention is that we have only got one fish talk today, but we will have many more at the World Conservation Congress discussions. And of course, it's tremendously important to highlight the mammals and the turtles and the birds, the reptiles, but we must also pay great attention to the fish and also, of course, to the invertebrates and habitat-forming organisms that we're not highlighting yet here. So let me go into some concluding comments. Where do we go with all of this? Well, I'm going to give you a superficial quick dash through some comments because you've heard a lot of great ideas already. One of the things we've realized is that low bycatch rates, low accidental capture rates can become huge problems. They can become huge catches and they can become huge problems. And Anne-Marie highlighted that when she talked about some of the numbers that were being caught around Colombia. We also know that even low bycatch rates of small-bodied fish can have conservation consequences. Seahorses are caught very rarely. Think about everything else that is caught in the bottom of the net. And another incarnation, we've got, we're showing that about, sorry, I've lost my plot there. Okay, and also the mitigation is only going to come in many cases from a reduction in the fishing footprint in space and in time. And this is really important. Like bottom trawls, there really isn't a way of modifying the gear to reduce the pressure on all the small stuff in the bottom of the net that are slow swimmers and will not escape the net. And many of the mitigation devices are not actually deployed well. Things like turtle excluder devices are often sewn shut, and so it goes. So we are going to have to focus on this issue of regulating these fisheries in space and time. And I particularly want to come back to the issue of bottom trawling now, because in many parts of the world, bottom trawling has become annihilation fishing. There is really no familiar management approach applied, and instead the trawls commonly go out to catch everything they can, and that is of great concern. So what we're going to need is national plans of action that, as everybody has pointed out, are appropriate and supportive for the context in which this work is being done. Some good ideas are emerging in the context of trawling. The Transform Bottom Trawling Coalition is a major alliance. And this has 4 foci. One is to expand national inshore zones where bottom trawling is already banned by governments because it creates conflict with small-scale fisheries. And I want to pick up on the point that we have to care about fisheries. We do. But as we've heard, bottom trawl fishing catches the young of species that would otherwise become important commercial fisheries for more selective gear. And it also disenfranchises and displaces small-scale fisheries, selective fisheries. So we need to be very cognizant of the fact some of these fisheries may have to be constrained and create win-wins, both with respect to the biodiversity and other fisheries. Transform bottom trawling is also talking about prohibiting bottom trawling in all marine protected areas and ending subsidies for bottom trawling. And we haven't talked about subsidies, but that too is an issue that needs attention. And we need to prohibit the expansion of bottom trawling and other non-selective gears into new areas of the ocean, particularly with the recent fantastic ratification of the High Seas Treaty. In a quick summary, I want to let you know that a paper we're about to release shows that habitats recover if we stop trawling. This is a meta-analysis, and out of 7,000 papers, we have found good evidence of habitat recovery, of species recovery if we stop, which is great news. And another piece of work we've been doing, we're showing that many of the people involved in bottom trawling, and indeed probably many other gears, did not choose to be involved in bottom trawling, may not even have a fishing history, but are either bumped to bottom trawling by the loss of other fisheries or are coming from hills and municipalities and urban areas where they just need a job. So the socioeconomic considerations need much more attention, absolutely. I want to end by pointing out that the World Conservation Congress event is a chance for us to explore and advance these ideas much more thoroughly, and we'd love you to attend. I want to thank the Reverse the Red and Megan for hosting this, and huge thanks to all my fellow panelists. I've really appreciated your wonderful talks, and of course, a special thanks to Coralie Palmer, who does so much to make our work effective. And with that, I will hand back to Megan.
Thank you all again so much for joining us. I just shared in the chat links to both the session that Amanda just shared on non-selective fisheries at the Congress, as well as an event that Reverse the Red is hosting in our pavilion on the 13th. We will be screening Treasure of the Caribbean, and Coralie will be moderating a discussion afterwards around that and that work on fisheries in the Caribbean there. So we really do hope to see you at the World Conservation Congress, and stay tuned if you're not able to travel. We will have some key takeaways and updates and things to share with you afterwards as well if you're not able to make it there. So thank you all so much for that wonderful session, awesome talks, and looking forward to continuing this discussion in Abu Dhabi.
Thank you so much.
Have you closed the panel, Megan? Okay, you've closed it?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. That was spectacular, and I learned so much. And did we record this, Megan, in any way?
Yes, it will be available on YouTube immediately following.
So that's a tremendous tool for us all to try to get the information out. And I guess you could, is there any way they could get their own talks? Because I think they could each use their own talks in special circumstances.
I can cut it for you if you want.
Would anybody like that done? Anne-Marie says, yes, please. Helene, do you want your talk? Would you like your talk provided to you? You're muted. Brian, talk.
I have mine. I drove the slides, so I have it. In fact, I was going to ask whether you all needed it. I won't be in Abu Dhabi, and I'm not sure who from MTSG. I think maybe Nick might be
Well,
the
we
only.
won't need your talk
Yeah.
because we have it now, but you drove the slides, but you didn't have your voice with your slides. And so it was really wonderful the way you delivered it as well.
Oh, the
So-
recording part, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
So, and Gianna, I thought I really